use?
Well, it depends on what your purpose is. The task of a transcendental argument is ultimately to establish certain a priori propositions. But you have lots of different kinds of transcendental arguments. You have Kant's, you have Husserl's, you have Heidegger's. Being and Time is a series of transcendental arguments about what he calls the existential categories of Dasein. So it's a Kantian enterprise on a different level. Russell, partly because he's influenced by the realist novelists, controversies of the Oxbridgians at the turn of the century, tended to reify logic. And you could see the Tractatus as an attempt to show that any attempt to reify logic is going to be mistaken. Wittgenstein in the Tractatus was sort of rediscovering something which would have been known by Aristotle and the medievals, that logic isn't about reality so much as it is about the relations between terms which we use to organize terms that are about reality. You could read the Tractatus as being a sort of rediscovery by Wittgenstein that there is a distinction between logical words and non-logical words. Logical words or non-logical words always refer to the empirical world or even the abstract world of mathematical entities, if you like. They have content. But the word all, the word no, the word some, the word not, these don't have content in that they refer, there's no notness in the world. Not is a way of talking that we use of talking about the world or to organize our world talking about it. So Wittgenstein really seems to have had very little understanding of the history of logic. And this was the sort of thing that was pretty much taken for granted by the medievals back in the Middle Ages. You could say in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein thinks there's one logic. In the investigation, he thinks that there are indefinitely many logics which indicate the rules governing particular language time. Well, Peirce died in 1914. From the start, his view was that there were three kinds of logic. There's deductive, there's inductive, and there's what he calls abductive or retrodictive logic. Russell tended to want to reduce even induction down to deduction. Keynes, to some extent, tended to want to reduce, partly influenced by Hume here, I think, and partly influenced by Bradley, wanted to reduce deduction down to induction. So they're both kind of reductive approaches. And that's why I say Peirce is interesting, because he doesn't want to go into that kind of reduction. Well, I might use such a quotation from either Kant or from someone like Russell. Although interesting enough,
from Russell said the categories mean nothing to me. I don't know what they refer to.
There are some fascinating quotations in Russell in which he talks about trying to make sense out of Kant, and in effect they amount to just totally confusing the transcendental and the empirical. In the history of Western philosophy, Russell really doesn't understand very much about Kant. That's why if you're really interested in Russell's views on the history of philosophy, you shouldn't read his early work, The History of Western Philosophy. You should read his later work. It's called The Wisdom of the West. The same is true of, for example, Will Durant's Story of Philosophy. One of the first works I read on the history of philosophy.
How was his treatment of Kant?
A little better than Russell's, but not much. You should read that sometime.
Well, if I have trouble sleeping some night, falling asleep one night.
He's a better writer than Russell is, interesting. But, and with regard to Russell, his best work of all of his works is a volume called An Inquiry Concerning An Inquiry into Meaning and Truth. Marvelously clear, marvelously well written, marvelously well argued. And there, of course, he essentially begins rejecting most of the early conclusions that he had about the history of philosophy in Problems of Philosophy and History of Western Philosophy.
Now, what the critics consider to be Russell's best work, some critics.
Probably Prof of philosophy.
No, it's his autobiography.
Oh yeah, sure.
Which he wrote.
Well, the typical way of doing it, I'm not necessarily in favor of this kind of approach, would be to talk about his relationship to his predecessors, Berkeley, Hume, Descartes, Locke, and there's a sense in which he sort of takes it for granted in writing the critique that the reader is familiar with all of these thinkers. The Critique of Pure Reason is a work for philosophers. He's not writing it for the ordinary person. And it is true that he wrote another work called The Prolegom of the New Future Metaphysics, which is the Reader's Digest version of the critique, as an attempt to make the conclusions and the basic arguments of the critique accessible to an ordinary educated person. But it's pretty much as I say, a Reader's Digest version. Yeah, I would say Peirce is a thinker who's on a par with Kant in terms of intellectual stature.
But what about someone who might say Kant is not a good read in philosophy because his style stinks? He doesn't get to the point.
I guess I don't understand why somebody would say that. It seems to me Kant has one of the clearest styles of philosophical writing that anybody has. You want somebody who's really tough to read in terms of clarity and difficulty of style. Somebody like Husserl.
Santayana. I think he's all over the place.
Yeah, but
Life of Reason, I'm thinking of.
Yeah, I think you're right. With him, it is somewhat a matter of sort of getting to the point. And the same with Husserl. Kant's writing for philosophers, trained intellects who have some knowledge of the background against which he's developing his own ideas. He's sort of assuming that his readers know what Descartes' position was, Locke's and Leibniz's and Berkeley and Hume. So that's one reason why it's difficult to read him, in part. A lot of his language has sort of built-in allusions to the work of those predecessors. And in fact, that's somewhat true of a lot of 20th century philosophers, I suggested last time. That, if you really want to know what Heidegger and Sartre and Camus are talking about, you've got to see them as sort of building on references to the history of philosophy. For Heidegger, you can't make sense out of him without seeing him as referring to Kant and to Descartes and Nietzsche and Hegel.
What would you say to the philosopher who just says, I think I'll skip Kant?
Well, what did I say last time? You can philosophize with Kant or against him. Not without him. At least not in the philosophy of the Western world today. But it is true that Kant does take translating. Not because he writes in German, but because he writes in a style where the language he uses is a function of his methodology. A term, when he first introduces it, has only a vague meaning. Then he uses it a little bit more, and you begin to see how he's using it and what he means. Then he uses it more, and he uses it more. And you begin to unpack the meaning, see how it's related to a term like intuition, for example. When he in the opening lines of the Transatlantic Aesthetic, he says, intuition is that by means of which we're in immediate relation to objects. What the hell does that mean? No way of knowing what all of these technical terms mean.